Good afternoon, or should I say, ni hao.
还可以。
So we're very, very glad to welcome in Sianspo Kevin Rudd. Kevin Rudd is the president of the Asia Society, but he's got a very, very, very long CV. I would only mention that he was a very successful Prime Minister of Australia. I was just reminding him of his very incredible leadership that he showed to help not only Australia, but also the whole world navigate the 2008 financial crisis. But for the purposes of today's conversation, Kevin Rudd is one of the most, at least as far as I'm concerned, the most knowledgeable person that I know on China. And of course, we are on the eve of the Chinese Communist Party Congress. This is not going to be a Congress like any other. It's a little bit different. It's the third term for President Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is not a president like any other. He's a president that maybe is taking China into a more assertive path. It's a moment of a strategic rivalry between the US and China. You only have to read the newspapers and see what's happening on the technology front with the measures that the US just recently took. But at the same time, it's a moment when maybe we have to realize that we need all systemic actors, and China is today a systemic actor, to address, to provide responses to our global challenges, from pandemics to financial stability, or to fight the fight of our century, which is climate change. So, this is what Kevin is here to help us understand. What's the direction China will take under Xi Jinping's third term? What to expect on the economic front? What to expect on the geopolitical front? Are we still capable of managing a coexistent, or are we moving into an inevitable fragmentation of the world? With these very few words, Kevin,
Good.
Floor to you.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you very much, Arantxa, and it's lovely to be back here in Paris, and to be part of the Kevinisation of France. It's a slogan, wasn't it, during the French elections?
That's right.
From Zemmour, we don't want Mohammedization or Kevinization. So je suis 5%, 50% of the problem. It's good that you're all here as students of Sciences Po. I've known this school over the years. It's the third time I've been in this auditorium, and probably over the last decade or so. And it's an international institution. It's not just a French institution. And you come from all over the world, so you have a first-class opportunity to become the world's future leaders. And you have an enormous benefit on the way through because you are with each other. And that is the best opportunity you have to learn, quite apart from distinguished professors and leaders like Arantxa, who have run the foreign ministries of her country, and those like her who are part of this faculty. Let me get a sense of where you're all from. Do we have students here from China, by the way? 中国来的学生比较多吗？ Yeah, 那太好了。 Do we have any from Taiwan? 台湾来的，你好。 最近比较麻烦嘛。I said there'd been a few problems recently. Anyone here from La Belle France? Seulement vous? Deux? Trois? Bienvenue. The people from Germany? Willkommen. Nice to have you guys here. I go from here to Berlin next week to spend some time with our friends in the German government, also on the China question. Elsewhere in Europe, La Bella Europa. Other Europeans? Good. Well, there is no European språk, but let me just say welcome to all of you. Anyone here from Sweden? Ah, Where are the Swedes gone? The reason I asked that, it was my first diplomatic posting. So here's the lesson for all of you who want to be diplomats. When I joined the Australian Foreign Service, I spoke with genuinely good Chinese because I've been 5 years studying it. And then I was their best Chinese speaker, and my first posting was Stockholm. So they sent me to Sweden to practice my Chinese. So, shit happens. What about from the rest of Asia? We've got people here from India. Good to see you. I've just been in Delhi too with Foreign Minister Jaishankar and others. Southeast Asia. Whereabouts? Singapore. I've been there recently too. My son lives in Singapore. So I'm often a recent visitor, as does my new granddaughter. And what about Australia? Bloody hell. All up the front, yeah. Let me tell you something about the Australian students. If ever you're feeling lonely, if ever you're feeling you need a party, these guys know how to do it. It's genetic, okay? And they'll know the best drinking holes within 100 metres of this place. Am I right? Yeah, they do. Yes, if you're very good. Anyone from New Zealand? Nouvelle-Zélande? It's good to have you. And our friends from... and have I missed anybody? Les États-Unis. Who's here from the United States? That's good to see you. I'm now a New Yorker, by the way. So the Asia Society is based on Park and 70th. So I've lived in New York since I left office. So, or as I prefer to say, after I came second in the elections. And means I didn't win. So I've been living in the United States for quite a while now as president of the Asia Society, which is a global think tank, do tank, which focuses on navigating shared futures between the countries of Asia and those of the rest of the world, including the United States. We have about 50 or so policy researchers out of 250 staff, and half of those are dedicated to the big question of China in our Centre for China Analysis. So let me just say 2 or 3 sets of things as I try and find a clock. Oh, there it is. Good. So we leave plenty of time for discussion. I'll talk a little bit about China, the 20th Party Congress, US-China relations, and whether we're destined for war. And my argument in my book, we're not destined for war. The book I've just written a few months ago and published in the United States is called The Avoidable War. The second thing I'll talk to you about toward the end of my remarks will be where US-China relations leaves us in the global political commons on the question of climate change action and the work that is being done and the work that is still to be done. And then let's open it for a discussion. And all the hard questions will be answered by Arantxa, and I'll take the easy ones.
That's a deal.
It's okay.
That's a deal.
China. People often ask, how did we get into this mess with US-China relations? And then they say, who is to blame? I now run a think tank. We're not into the blame game. We're into the analysis business, which is what actually is happening out there. Because if you have good analysis, it can produce good policy. If you produce bad analysis, it will always produce bad policy. So if I look at the underpinning structure of US-China relations, it usually goes down into sort of 3 boxes. Structural changes which we should be mindful of. One is the evolving nature of the balance of power between the United States and China in East Asia and the West Pacific. That balance has been changing. China is becoming more powerful militarily, economically, technologically. And as a consequence, when there are times of changes in the global balance of power, you will find that you have greater instability in the overall international order. It's been that way for hundreds of years. It's a realist view of international relations, but that's part of the reality, if not the total reality. The second structural factor at play, in my judgment, is the particular leadership personality of Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping is not a status quo politician. Xi Jinping wants to change the status quo, drawing on the fact that the balance of power is changing, and in his assessment in China's favour. He took a decision probably from about 2014 to abandon China's previous diplomacy, which under Deng Xiaoping was called Tao Guang Yang Hui, Zhui Dang To, hide your strength, bide your time, never take the lead, and a new global strategy of Fen Fa Your Wei, which is striving for achievement, changing the status quo in a manner more compatible with China's interests and values. China's previous leaders, Deng, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, though we skip over the two who were purged, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. The three main previous leaders were leaders who placed absolute priority on the economic development of China and made foreign policy a servant of this economic agenda. Xi Jinping has a different view. Rather than having a passive approach to foreign policy, he has an active approach to foreign policy and therefore seeks to leverage China's newfound economic power in order to achieve wider foreign policy objectives for his country. That's the second underpinning factor driving all the change that we debate each day. The third one is that since about 2017, Uncle Sam has decided to respond. The United States, as of the National Security Strategy released by H.R. McMaster at the end of that year, and for which the supplement has just been released a few days ago by Jake Sullivan, the new National Security Advisor, both of whom I know well and worked with in think tanks and when they've been in office as well. That National Security Strategy of 2017 formally redefined the US relationship with China, this changing China as the Americans observed it, from a strategic framework of, quote, strategic engagement to a new strategic framework of what they call strategic competition. And the reason that they've chosen to use that term is because they judge that there is a race now underway, economically, foreign policy terms, militarily, technologically, for who becomes the preeminent regional and global power by mid-century. And they, therefore, are developing a series of strategies, both for themselves and for their allies, to cooperate in order to preserve the existing international rules-based order against China's challenge to it. These are the three sets of structural forces at work underneath everything that you see, or most things that you see. So when things bubble up to the surface, whether it's the debate about technology this week or whether it's next week, a debate about some obscure aspect of foreign policy in a region you've never heard of before, my counsel to you would be to look at these three sets of underpinning structural forces at work, because those are driving the debate and the reality which underpins the debate. That brings us to the question of what does China want? The question I get asked all around the world is, who is Xi Jinping? What does he want for both his own country and what does he want for the world? These are quite profound questions for which there are no easy answers. The spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Ministry doesn't stand up every Tuesday morning and says, this is what we want. It's not the nature of the Chinese system. But because I've been around for a while, a little longer than these guys up the front, I've deduced the following quick 10 points. Don't worry, the 30 seconds are hit. We'll get through it in 5 minutes. When I'm asked, what does Xi Jinping want, I've tried to construct it in what I would describe as a CCP, Chinese Communist Party version of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, starting from the most important, moving to the least important but still important. Number one is for Xi Jinping to secure the Communist Party still to be in power. It's a Marxist-Leninist party. It got there through the barrel of a gun in 1949 after being born in 1921. It's not about to surrender power, nor is Xi Jinping about to surrender power within it. And so much of Xi Jinping's strategy, and since he's been in office, has been a determined resolve to take the party more towards the Leninist left in order to reconsolidate the power of the party within Chinese politics, in a way which runs counter to the course of his three most recent predecessors, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. Strategic interest number 2 is maintain and obtain the unity of the motherland. This is fundamental to the political legitimacy in China, hence their policies in Tibet, hence their policies in Xinjiang, hence their policies in Hong Kong, and hence their prospective policies in Taiwan. These are axiomatic to the party's self-perception of its own legitimacy and therefore its long-term mission. So when you see missiles firing over Taiwan, it proceeds from this underpinning, core and continuing strategic objective. Number 3 is grow the economy. Grow the economy for 2 reasons: to lift people's living standards in order to improve the life of average Chinese who have spent most of their lives and most of their previous generations' lives in abject poverty. The party has made some remarkable achievements on this score through a long period of 35 to 40 years of systemic economic reform. Although Xi Jinping has now changed the growth formula, removed the significance of the market from being at the centre of things, reimposed the centrality of the party state into the market, as a consequence, the growth rate in recent years has slowed somewhat. But the second purpose of this agenda item is to ensure that the Chinese economy underpins Chinese national power, not just the individual well-being and living standards of your individual citizen. Number 4 in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, Chinese style, is to do this economic growth trick while sustaining new levels of environmental sustainability and climate sustainability. This is new. The China that I grew up with didn't do that. In fact, the China that I actually confronted when I was Prime Minister of Australia at the Copenhagen Conference on Climate Change, COP16, was adamantly opposed to that. But as of about 2011, and certainly by the time we got to Paris here for COP21, thank you. I've lost my COPs. Let's call that a pre-Alzheimer attack. The Chinese, by the time we get to COP21 in Paris, had concluded that this was real, the science was real, and that China also needed to act to reduce its own greenhouse gas emissions, because absent the largest emitter of the world, and China now representing nearly 30% of global emissions, where they are on the development curve, that it would mean disasters for the planet, but also disasters for China itself, given how large they are as their greenhouse footprint goes. Number 5 is modernise the Chinese military and to ensure that China's People's Liberation Army, Navy, Air Force and other elements of it are in a state to fight and win wars, quote unquote. That's Xi Jinping's mission to the PLA. Number 6 is China's 14 neighbouring states. It's 周边国家. They have 14 land neighbours, a little more than Australia. And their particular diplomacy directed to their land neighbouring states is as follows: to use the economy to leverage and the gravitational pull of their economies to make their 14 neighbouring states benign towards China's foreign policy interests and its national interests, and ultimately compliant. Success with a number, take Russia for example, less success with others, take Vietnam for an example. That's neighbouring state diplomacy. Number 7, look to China's maritime periphery to the east. China's strategy is to, over time, push the United States back to Guam and ideally back towards the Central Pacific in order to make military reunification with Taiwan possible, if and when it is needed. And part and parcel of that is to also seek to break US traditional military alliance structures with its Asian allies, namely Japan, the Republic of Korea, Australia, and the other 2, Thailand and the Philippines. Number 8, if you go west of China to its continental periphery as opposed to its maritime periphery, to use the Belt and Road Initiative and other mechanisms of Chinese economic power to turn Central Asia, Central Europe, Eastern Europe and Western Europe eventually into a vast Eurasian pan-continental zone of economic opportunity for China to continue to grow its economy through a new market for Chinese infrastructure-based companies capable of building power systems, capable of building dams, capable of building roads, construction companies represented by the Chinese state, but on the way through concessional finance, again create through the leverage of the Chinese economy a series of foreign policy relationships across the vast Eurasian continent, which are much more responsive to China's foreign policy aspirations and needs. There's only 2 to go in this babushka doll, starting from the centre and moving out. Number 9 is when you look at the rest of the world, the rest of Asia, Latin America and Africa, again to leverage China's formidable capabilities through the Belt and Road Initiative, but also other investment vehicles to ensure that the infrastructure needs of the G77 are met increasingly by China's investment capabilities. Just to give you a sense of the quantum, the size of the Belt and Road Initiative when it was originally launched was about $3 trillion US. So far there's been expended $875 billion US, and with mixed results around the world. Some have been extraordinarily positive, others less so. Take, for example, in Sri Lanka, if you followed carefully the indebtedness of the Sri Lankan government over the port project built by China there, and China's decision instead to have its future obligations met by taking a lease itself over that port for 99 years. China currently has about 12 countries in levels of debt distress around the world because of levels of overborrowing or because of the inability of current economic circumstances to allow those countries to repay on their concessional loan schedule. But to every negative story, there are many positive stories around the world as well. Which brings me to 10, China's efforts to use its increasing levels of support right across the developing world to add political support and votes in the United Nations to support Chinese candidatures to become heads of international organisations, to use their funding levels of support for the UN system and other international institutions to increasingly leverage those institutions in a manner which is more compatible with Chinese interests and values. And on top of that again, to also begin to construct new institutions outside the UN and the Bretton Woods framework. For example, the Asian Infrastructure Bank, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, SICA, the Institution for Security and Confidence Building Measures in Asia, etc. And until recently, the 17+1 arrangement with Eastern Europe. And the whole objective there is to begin the process of redesigning the international system in a manner, again, which is more consistent with Chinese interests and values. And that's where you have the intersection between traditional human rights norms as outlined in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights in 1948, and China's counter-narrative and its redefinition of human rights and redefinition of democracy, and its efforts to remove those classical clauses from a number of UN instruments. Hi folks, come on in, take a seat up the front, doesn't matter if you're late, it's not church, or it could be if you'd like, so come up this way. So, in summary, that's 10 core sets of interests. And I think, again, when you watch the debate about what does China want and how is America responding to it, that's my best attempt, which others may challenge, to distill the hierarchy of needs as experienced from a Marxist-Leninist party, which has been in power since 1949. And in doing that, Xi Jinping's particular leadership style has been to bring about a revamp of ideology at the centre of things. And he's done so in 3 specific respects. I've mentioned one of them and intimated another. he's pushed the centre of gravity of Chinese politics more towards the Leninist left through a much more powerful party with less space and room for private individuals in China or for non-government organisations, or for that matter, for non-party players in the economy like the private sector. Which brings me to the second big ideological change, particularly since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, when he began to push the centre of gravity of Chinese economic policy more towards the left, more back to the party, back to the state, back to industrial planning, back to a new concept of national self-sufficiency, back to a new doctrine which is called the dual circulation economy, which is code language for China being less dependent on the world in the future, but the world being more dependent on China. And a new concept of common prosperity to reduce the fact that China had become one of the most unequal countries in the world, which you can see attested by the Gini coefficient data, which I'm sure you study in class. His third big ideological change, permeating the 10 points I referred to before, is his decision not just on Marxism-Leninism to move the centre of gravity to the left, but to move the centre of gravity on Chinese nationalism to the right, underpinning a more assertive Chinese foreign security policy in the region and the world. Now, to conclude in my last few minutes, so what the hell do we do about all that? Or, as Lenin said without the hell bit, he said, so what then shall we do? Vladimir Ilyin's response would be somewhat different to the one I'm going to give you. But the problem right now is that we do have a first-class strategic contest underway for the reasons I outlined at the beginning of my remarks this evening. And Xi Jinping has defined clearly with his mission for 中华民族伟大复兴 by 2049年 2049, for China to become the preeminent regional and global power, 领先国家, not 领先国家之一, not one of the leading powers, but to be the 领先国家, the leading power. And the Americans have said, together with their allies, no thank you. We don't like that, and we're going to fight you tooth and nail to prevent that from happening. And no side will actually say it in as blunter terms that I've just said, but that's what I'm here for. I'm from Australia, I'm here to help. So you can either have an approach, which is what we got at present, which is unmanaged strategic competition, where there are no rules of the road, there are no guardrails, so any day of the week, anything could happen in this crazy relationship. Two rampaging 1,000-pound gorillas in the front living room of the international relations community, and with no rules. If you ever watched World Championship Wrestling on American television, yeah, that looks more elegant compared with what we've currently got going on in geopolitics at the moment. And the dress standards are somewhat improved on that as well. But what I mean in reality is there is so much metal flying around, so many ships at sea, almost colliding, in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, and in and around Taiwan. So much metal in the air, aircraft being intercepted by fighter jets every day of the week, or almost every day of the week, and other what they call grey zone activities, for those of you who've studied the region, which is not naval assets, but Coast Guard assets, fishing assets, etc. And literally hundreds and thousands of vessels out there, if you aggregate it across those three sub-regions. So it's a matter of statistical probability that sooner or later you're going to have some collisions. And when you have a collision, what history tells us, international relations practice tells us, is you have an incident which is capable of escalation. When nationalism then rolls its way into the equation, you can have, therefore, crisis, conflict and war. Case study 101, 1914. A small thing becomes a big thing very quickly through a total failure of diplomacy. Or you can go to what I've recommended in the last 3 chapters of my book, entitled The Avoidable War. Harry, you don't have a copy of my book, do you?
Giving them all out.
You're giving them all out, okay. So Harry works for me in New York. So as you can tell, he has a broad Bronx accent. So, not really. He's Upper West Side, aren't you, Harry?
That's true.
Yeah. And so The bottom line is this. The book, which is entitled The Avoidable War, explains what I call managed strategic competition. It's a realist concept. It doesn't say that we can somehow wish this strategic contest away. What I describe as sprinkling, Scandinavian fairy dust across the top of something in the hope that everyone feels better in the morning after a bit of shiatsu massage. And we've had a dialogue, and I've heard your feelings and you've heard my feelings, and we understand each other better in the morning, and it'll be all right by 3 o'clock in the afternoon after a drink or two, or the next morning after another drink or two. I've got to tell you, it ain't like that. And it's never been like that. So the realist concept I advance is simply, how do we avoid crisis, conflict and war by accident during the rest of the 2020s? And what I, through managed strategic competition, outline is just 3 principles. Constructing guardrails around the 5 sets of strategic red lines which de facto already exist. Over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over the East China Sea, on the Korean Peninsula, and in cyber and space. So that each side knows what the irreducible red lines are of the other side in order to reduce the possibility and probability of miscalculation. The second is, if you can agree on that, or at least understand where each side is coming from, to have a joint strategic framework which permits non-lethal strategic competition in the rest of the relationship, the rest of foreign policy, the rest of security policy, the economy, trade, technology, ideology, the underpinning ideational notions for the future of the international system. And then finally, still to have sufficient political and diplomatic capital to provide space for global public goods. And that is the ones that we must address if we're going to save the planet. Climate change action, domestic and global. The clock's ticking, you all know that. 1.5 degrees is slipping away from us. 450 parts per million is there. And it's practically be consumed in the biosphere already, given the aggregation of greenhouse gas emissions. But also beyond that, global public goods in public health, global financial stability, and nuclear non-proliferation. That's the argument. To conclude, why am I still rolling around in public life? I have 2 fundamental interests. One, to prevent unintended war between China and the United States by reducing the risk of miscalculation. And 2, to clear the space for global climate change action. That's what I'm around doing. That's what I'm trying to do. Join the cause.
So first, yes, it's true that Kevin Rudd has written the book. He's given me the last piece, so I just thought that I would confirm. There are worse nightmares.
If you buy copies, lots of them will send you free steak knives too.
So, floor is to you. As usual, you go to the mic, you put your question. You say briefly who you are. You have a brief question because I'm sure there's going to be many. And then Kevin will try to give us his best. Gentleman over there.
Hello. Is that clear? Yeah. So thank you very much for your very comprehensive laying down of what's ahead of us. I'm Himmel and I work for the Observatory of the Indo-Pacific here at CERI at Sciences Po. I have 2 questions. The first question is, do you think that the Indo-Pacific is inherently an anti-Chinese sort of construct? And that leads me to my second question, which is the role of India in the Indo-Pacific. So how do you view the role of India in light of how they've been voting? They've been sort of trying to run this really tight rope. And, I read your article in Foreign Affairs, The World According to Xi Jinping, and I recommend everyone read that because it's really enlightening. And there you state that we will have an ideological conflict because that's what Xi Jinping believes in. So in light of that, do you think that India cannot walk this tightrope for too long?
Okay, I think I got the question. So, a few thoughts. The Indo-Pacific as a concept is not inherently anti-Chinese. It's a statement of geography. And the fact that the two oceans are linked, and the fact that you have the US Pacific Fleet and the Middle East Fleet, which operate in both these oceans and have done so really since the Second World War. And the China's fleet deployments increasingly operate across the so-called String of Pearls. Ports are across southern Asia and into the new Chinese naval base in Djibouti in the Red Sea, and prospectively on the east coast of Africa. Together with that, you have Mother India, which, given its geography, is the country after which that ocean happens to be named. We thought of calling it the Australian Ocean, but you got there first by about 4,500 years. And so this thing, the Indo-Pacific, is of itself, I think, a neutral term. The Quad, which you've just described, which brings together Japan, Australia, and India and the United States, that is a geopolitical construct, and it is anti-China. It is designed to rebalance Chinese power. The conclusion geopolitically by the member states of the Quad is that China, by asserting its naval presence, its economic presence, its foreign policy footprint across this wider region, left unchallenged, would cause regional states, smaller regional states with no alternative but to bandwagon with China as opposed to balance against China. That's the strategic calculus. Again, none of the governments will say this explicitly. I'm just being blunt about it in a very Australian sort of way. We say in Australia, we call a spade a shovel. And therefore, it is designed to rebalance as opposed to bandwagon with China, and as a consequence to create more strategic space and options for other countries who are not part of the Quad to have greater strategic and political autonomy than they may otherwise feel. That's the logic. On the India question, I'll close on this because I see lots of folk want to ask questions and we've got about 25 minutes left. Far be it from me to opine on the Indian government, but I do note, having recently been in Delhi for 8 days and spent a lot of time with the Indian government, that the bottom line is that their conclusion is that after the Sino-Indian border clashes of 2020, they have concluded there is no political possibility of rebuilding a normal relationship with Beijing. And therefore, it has chosen to move to the Quad geopolitically and to the West through a whole new series of free trade agreement negotiations economically in order to secure India's future. Do I see that as long-term and sustainable? Look, to the extent that I can pick up a barometer in politics domestically from both, frankly, the BJP and Congress and the think tank community and the foreign security and intelligence community with whom I spoke, I think this is a fundamental shift in Indian strategic direction. And as for the balancing act with Mother Russia, which I think you had inferred in the last part of your question, I think that's got about a 5-year fuse until China burns down its own defence dependency on Russia through its current kit and equipment, which is all Russian from the past, and where resupply, spare parts and ammunition have to be secured. But beyond that, as the Indian military has already indicated, it's the future kit and equipment of the Indian Armed Forces in all services will come increasingly from the West. That's my best answer, sir.
Thanks.
Thank you. No. There is no. There is lots of people waiting. Let's be generous to others. Thank you, gentlemen over there, please.
Thank you for giving me the floor, and thanks for the very insightful presentation. My name is Lorenzo. I study urban policy, so you might think I'm not the right place, but I wrote my thesis last year on the great power competition between China and the United States and how it plays out in the South Pacific. And I would like to move the focus to the South Pacific island states. And maybe what do you think about their position in this great power competition, especially given that maybe they possibly have more leverage as they have more great powers that are interested in influencing them? Do you think that their leverage increases, or that they're still eventually are the small ones and as China and the United States?
The beginning of wisdom in international relations, something for you all to bear in mind, given you're here at Sciences Po, the beginning of wisdom in international relations is to understand how other people think and to start the analysis from how the Pacific Island countries think. There are 13 of them, spread across Melanesia, Polynesia and Micronesia. And in my own time in office, I got to know them all really well. And subsequent Australian Labor governments have made it their business to do so, and subsequent Australian Conservative governments have made it their business not to do so. Not that I wish to be partisan, but I am. Because we appreciate complexity, and our Conservative opponents in Australia have always preferred binaries and not really interested in the aspirations of those within the neighbourhood. We do. We've had long-standing development partnerships with each of those countries, which have been respectful, mutually agreed, because each of those countries is quite vulnerable, A, to climate, B, to the absence of significant industries for export other than fisheries, and C, their fisheries resources are being encroached by a whole bunch of foreign powers, and not just China, also Taiwan, also Korea, also Japan, and also other countries as well. So understanding the neighbourhood from the inside out is frankly the most important first step. Secondly, for Australia, New Zealand and the United States to consolidate their own strategic interests in the region must have that as its first building block. Otherwise, it will be legitimately seen within the region as being utterly cynical. Our friends in the Pacific Island countries are not dumb. They've dealt with Australia, New Zealand and the United States for the better part of a century, and through the entire decolonisation process, largely involving the Brits and the French, and sometimes the Americans. And so therefore, working on their common needs for fisheries surveillance, fisheries stocks protection, climate change, these are the doorways to, in fact, a long-term strategic community between Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and these countries. If they do it well, then the strategic aspirations of China and others in the region will frankly be passed to one side. The danger for China in the region is, one, it is compromised by the aggressive posture of its fisheries in the South Pacific, and B, the fact that it is explicitly interested in strategic real estate in order to position naval bases. Here we are as Australia, having been their closest partner for the better part of 3/4 of a century. We don't have a single base out there anywhere because we don't think that's helpful for the countries of the region. So therefore, China may enter the region with a large checkbook, but I think its fisheries presence and its singularity of its interest in terms of a military naval base, I think will count against it. But we in the West could completely screw this up if we're not careful. And the previous Australian Conservative government screwed it up a lot. Not that I wish to be partisan.
Thank you very much. Gentleman over there.
Hi there. Thanks for being here. My name is Ben. I'm Canadian, and I'm studying international security here at Sciences Po. My question refers to...
Where are you from in Canada?
Vancouver.
Okay, West Coaster. Okay,
yes.
Good.
My question is referring to climate change cooperation between the U.S. and China. China has generally refrained from framing climate change as a security issue in international forums like the United Nations Security Council, instead preferring to frame it as a development issue. But in recent years, we've seen an increased kind of securitization of climate change in China with an energy policy and economic interests. How do you think this new dynamic will impact potential U.S.-Chinese climate change cooperation?
The good thing about the Chinese system is that they are creatures of science. And the Chinese system has scientifically concluded around about 2010 that A, this was for real, and B, there was no alternative for the future of the planet and the future of China itself than to become major actors in greenhouse gas reductions. So anyone who thinks that China is acting to reduce greenhouse gases because they love me, or they love you, or they love the United States, or are indifferent to all of the above, has just got it wrong. They're acting because they've looked at the science and they've decided to act nationally and globally. The second point is there's a legitimate argument as to whether they're acting fast enough. Xi Jinping's commitment is carbon neutrality by 2060. That's not good enough for the planet. It needs to come in at 2050, and their carbon peaking goals for the 2020s through to 2030 are not ambitious enough either. And that's for the country with the largest global footprint now. And by the 2030s, early 2040s, they will have the largest cumulative footprint. Gas is already up there, and gases they're pumping out each year. So the whole moral argument of the West taking the, as it were, development footprint away from China and India evaporates really about 2035, 2038, when China and India and the emerging economies represent more cumulatively than what the Europeans and the Americans have done through the Industrial Revolution. On the question of US-China climate diplomacy, something I've been directly involved in is at a think tank level, because when the Chinese and the Americans play no speaksies, which is what often happens, we in think tank land then facilitate 1.5 tracks between the two governments, and involving the senior people in both governments to make sure that there is still active collaboration just below the surface on what actually happens in the real international negotiations. And I'm happy to report that at this stage, despite all the bad karma that seems to be around on this subject, and the technical suspension of those talks as a consequence of the Taiwanese reaction to Speaker Pelosi's recent visit to Taiwan, that just below the surface, it's still ticking along. And so I think the real question is not one about the machinery of climate change negotiation and action. It is about the political momentum necessary for the world at large, both directed at China, critically India as an emerging giant emitter, but also the other big emitters in the world, including Japan, the European Union, the United States. And I'm pleased to report that my own country has decided to rejoin the world with the last election as well, and become a climate change actor rather than a climate change denier. Thank you.
Thank you. A lady over there.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Jimena, and I come from Spain. I'm studying a master's.
So does Arantxa.
Yes.
It's a beautiful country. I've been there a lot.
I like it as well.
What town are you from?
Madrid.
Okay, I think I've heard of Madrid.
Yeah.
So my question was related to Xi Jinping's common prosperity initiatives and his general shift to the left. And I was wondering if this could potentially create some sort of revolt amongst the Chinese elite. And despite his tight control over his population, is there a possibility of maybe his power being threatened by the people that would be losing from this ideological shift?
That's a great question. It's part of the subject I covered in this piece I've just written for Foreign Affairs magazine. If you're interested, you'll find it online. It came out about 3 days ago, called The World According to Xi Jinping. He has moved the centre of gravity to the left. The people who potentially benefit from it are those government workers and those low-income earners who may benefit from the practical operationalisation of the common prosperity agenda. But we don't know yet whether this is really a slogan or whether it's actually going to result in substantive income redistribution. There's uncertainty about that. The other measures, however, about the private sector, such as an increased power for state-owned enterprises, a crackdown on anything which the party deems to be a looming private sector monopoly, a particular crackdown on the tech sector, Alibaba, Jack Ma, Tencent, JD, Didi, these major brand companies, is huge. Against the property sector, partly because Xi Jinping doesn't approve of the property sector, which in Marxist-Leninist terms he describes as belonging to the fictitious economy. Straight quote from Das Kapital, 1848. You should have a look. Interesting how these things kick around. But if you've had your house prices jacked up enormously, I'd be reading Das Kapital too, probably. But the problem is when he says you've got to separate out houses for speculation as opposed to houses for living in, and you dismiss the entirety of the property development sector and the finance underpinning it, you tend not to produce enough new capacity for working people to live in. So therefore, the bottom line is, does all this create political antibodies in the system as the entrepreneurial class, which now represents 61% of Chinese GDP, do they, as it were, create a political reaction? My judgment would be at this stage, no, because the tools of political repression available to Xi Jinping, including the surveillance state, his ability to control the security and intelligence apparatus, is so wide and so broad that it can sniff things in the bud very quickly. Look, recently there was a breakout of some low-level protests outside a rural bank in the outer suburbs of Zhengzhou in Henan province. These things were taken down within a few hours. So, but here is my big but. If you let this stuff roll along for the next 5 years, by the time you get to the 21st Party Congress, I cannot predict what shape and form progressive alienation of the private sector will take. If living standards stagnate because economic growth stagnates at between 2 and 3%, then suddenly the unofficial social contract between the Communist Party and the people is compromised. And so what you've then got left for legitimacy purposes? Nationalism. And that becomes dangerous for us all, but probably unpersuasive to a whole bunch of people within China. So no danger yet, question mark where we stand by the time we get to the 21st Congress.
Gracias. The lady to the...
Hi, my name's Amanda. I'm from China. I study international governance and diplomacy, concentration on global risks. Thank you first. And I'll keep my questions short. The first question is, what's your view on China?
One question only.
China's zero COVID policy. What do you think is the rationale and the influence in the world, basically, and what could be the prospect? There are theories or rumors say, is this because of the Congress, the party's Congress? Is this a test of China's dependency of the world? And then the second short question is, do you think...
No, let me go. I've got to just do one because there's a big crowd waiting. On zero COVID, what I'd say is this, and I'm going to try to keep each answer to a minute because we've got a lot of people waiting. One, in the Chinese system, the leader can never be wrong. Okay? We should have had that in Australia. I'd still be in office. But, number two, he's declared a victory in the people's war against COVID. Three, therefore you can't allow COVID to break out, because go back to one above, the leader can never be wrong. Four, I know it's damaging the economy by shutting down big cities like Shanghai, Shenzhen and elsewhere. Five, what do I do about it? Well, I pursue zero COVID across the country where necessary. But I'm also working with my friends in the Hong Kong SAR to work out whether their new model of individually supervised medical supervision, as opposed to suburban-wide or city-wide lockdown, can be the way forward. Now, the Hong Kongers will tell us that this model is actually working in a large urban enclave of 7 million people. If it does, then what you should look out for is, once we're through the Party Congress, for this to be trialled throughout cities in Guangdong, next year across cities across the country, and then it to be fully nationally implemented. Hong Kong is your best barometer for where China will go. And I don't think it's got anything to do with the 20th Party Congress directly. But I don't think Xi Jinping wants any bad news, like a big breakout on the eve of the 20th Party Congress either.
Thank you very much. Lady over there.
Hi, thank you very much for being here. I'm Ellen, I'm Australian. I'm a former student from here who wrote my thesis on Australia's development program in the Pacific and how climate change fits into the program.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you could share a perspective a little bit on how development cooperation fits into all of this, because obviously you have a new Australian government who's reinvesting in the Pacific and in Southeast Asia through the development program. You have a new approach from the US in the Pacific that's building up a new development policy to re-engage with the Pacific, we could say. And then, of course, you have China, who's a continuing presence. And I wonder if there's a way to produce good development outcomes and positive climate action within the context of development programs, if it's all couched in this sort of strategic competition,
Sure.
as it were.
My melancholy duty to inform you is that all governments will have politics and strategic questions at the back of their mind, even if they don't articulate. Maybe not the government of Spain, but certainly the government of other countries. But it doesn't mean that it's the exclusive consideration or even the dominant consideration. It will be a consideration. So they're not unclean for thinking that, so long as you're not ignoring the intrinsic development needs of the people of the region concerned. Secondly, when I was Prime Minister, what I tried to do is introduce Pacific-wide what I call Pacific Compacts for Development. You may have studied these. This was my idea in my head, because I could see, even a decade ago, that you had all these development partners overwhelming the aid-receiving bureaucracies of the Pacific Island countries to the point that these were not being properly delivered on the ground, let alone coordinated one with the other. C, at a Pacific Island forum which I chaired, I think I was then chair of the PIF, I got all the heads of government, all 15 including ours in New Zealand, to agree that we would do this, plus every other partner government in the world, EU, the Brits, the Americans, except the Chinese, who refused. Because the whole idea was to have public transparency on a combined website run by the Pacific Island Forum, where we'd all input every piece of any development program we would advance with the funding attached, so that everybody knew what was going where at any given time. But China did not want that level of transparency. It's a matter of documentary fact. For the future, that should be reintroduced. That's my judgment. And secondly, all these governments should also prioritise what can be done through the multilateral development banks. The multilateral development banks, in this case the Asian Development Bank, has got a lot of infrastructure with which to assess the viability of individual projects and to mesh them against SDG criteria, Sustainable Development Goal criteria. It's a combination of donor-state collaboration through something like the Pacific Compacts for Development, plus using properly the MDGs in order to ensure that it advantages people on the ground.
Thank you very much. Over there.
Hello, my name is Cecilia. So you mentioned China having lent money to developing countries that are at risk of defaulting on debt, or that already defaulted on the debts, like in the Sri Lankan case. What will China do about this?
Well, the real debate right now is between China and the Paris Club on debt rescheduling. The Paris Club, a long time ago, involving most OECD countries who lend, including their private banks, not just public loan facilities, have criteria which says that when a recipient country is in financial distress, that we have given criteria for debt rescheduling. A, this is good for the recipient country concerned. B, enlightened self-interest for the lending countries, is that it reduces the risk of a sovereign default, which we know from recent financial history is capable of triggering system-wide crises across the international financial system. So that's where we've got to in terms of our collective wisdom. China, however, continues to resist full cooperation with the Paris Club, even though on infrastructure lending, China is now the single largest creditor country in the world. As I said, I think it was here, maybe it was an earlier forum today somewhere, 875 billion has now been expended by China under the BRI, and there are differing calculations about how much of that has led to a loan distress in individual countries. So what should be done about it? Our friends in Beijing need to join the Paris Club, because we all have a combined interest in A, not causing those countries who have been loan recipients to have to surrender their economic assets, as happened in Sri Lanka, and B, not to trigger a financial crisis.
Thank you very much. Lady over there.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name's Ava, I'm from Adelaide. I just had a quick question.
Where's that, by the way?
You probably wouldn't have heard of it. Pretty
small town in South Australia. My wife's from Adelaide, she won't forgive me for saying that.
Goodness.
Where'd you go to school?
Where did I go to school? Pembroke.
Pembroke, okay.
Do you know it?
She went to Wilderness and St. Peter's. Is your school more posh than hers, or is her school?
No, nothing's posh than
Okay, good,
Wilderness.
got it. Just getting it right. I went to Yamundi Primary School. So, 2 teachers.
So my question is a little bit different to the other questions, but I think still relevant to the global order of things. A little while ago, I signed your petition for a royal commission into the Murdoch media, and I was just wondering how you feel the Australian government or anyone else has responded to that, and what you see as the future for the Murdoch media.
Good. Well, Murdoch I regard as a cancer on democracy everywhere, not just in Australia. If there was no Rupert Murdoch and no Fox, I don't think we would have had January 6th, and I doubt we would have had Donald Trump. Nor do I think we would have had Brexit, given Murdoch's power in the British media through both the Sun and the Times of London. Furthermore, Murdoch, through Fox in particular, has pioneered the art of fake news and certainly popularised the concept. It wasn't just a Trump innovation, it was reflected in the looking glass by the Murdoch platforms. And having been back in Australia in COVID and having run the Asia Society for 2 years from my basement in Australia, wearing a very colourful pair of Hawaiian shorts, I reabsorbed how bad this was back home. Murdoch has been cancerous in terms of global climate change progress, constantly campaigning against governments for taking climate change seriously, but more broadly, fanning the politics of the far right in these 3 English-speaking countries, which have some consequence in the international community. By the way, New Zealand and Canada have never had Murdoch media. And look at the difference. I'll leave it to you to reflect on. So where's it got up to? Yes, we got about 1 million signatures in a short period of time. I launched this petition in Australia. And since the change in government, I think what's important to note is that about 1 week ago, the independents in the Parliament brought on a debate about the Royal Commission. I think what you'll see is an unfolding debate within the Parliament and certainly within the conferences of the Australian Labor Party about the future of media regulation. And depending on how the conferences go of the Labor Party itself, you may find that an inquiry of some form takes place. It's slow progress, and the reason for it is this: people are still frightened of him. And people say, Kevin, you're very courageous for doing this, to which I've said, well, I've just got so much scar tissue I don't notice anymore. And I keep asking the question, what more could he do to me? But it's important that we hold up this to a public account, because the way in which the media reports facts and opinion matters. Murdoch's cancerous influence has been this: to converge fact with opinion and simply to make it one thing, so that Tucker Carlson equals fact and opinion in the mind of the American viewing public on Fox television. But thank you for your question.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'll run a bit later so that people get their questions in.
Great. Okay, so we're going to do this now very telegraphically. We're going to take 3 questions in a go. Telegraphic, please. Lady over there.
First of all, thank you, Your Honourable Kevin Rudd, for your innovative and insightful speech. I'm Elsa from Lithuania, a dual degree student in international governance and diplomacy. I have a deep passion for China, its foreign policy in particular, and as we don't usually strive to understand the country, but rather to have an opinion
Harry, you got some paper? Harry, paper. Sorry.
And rather have an opinion of the country and be captivated by one all-pervasive narrative. As a young sinologist, I feel I see an acute sense of responsibility to unpack complex Chinese realities in a substantiated ways. So my question would be how to effectively temperate and moderate prejudices and biases towards China dictated by its nature of political regime.
Okay, got it. I've got to give the Telegraph
over
response.
there.
You've got to ask the Telegraph question. Yep.
Hi, I'm Xanthi. I'm on exchange from ANU in Canberra.
My old university. Yep.
Yeah, I know. I went to Bergman as well.
Oh, my old college.
Yeah. Anyway, you've been speaking about unintended war, But just in light of the war in Ukraine, I feel like there are so many similarities between Putin and Xi Jinping's rhetoric in terms of like aggrieved nationalism and the century of humiliation and the end of the USSR. So is it really going to be an unintended war, or is there a possibility that Xi Jinping is heading in the same direction?
Good, great, got it, yeah.
Thank you. And then the next one, and then Kevin will answer these three.
Thank you for your thoughts tonight. My name is Blake. I'm a law student from Melbourne. I was wondering your thoughts on the capacity of trade to sustain relations between states. Under your first term of prime ministership, there were some difficult moments with the China relationship, but trade increased exponentially in iron ore and coal and wool. I was wondering the extent to which you think it will either exacerbate or give a reason to sort of keep talking.
Okay, good. Quickly on those three. The question from our professional sinologist is what can be done through the professional study of sinology more effectively to reduce mutual misunderstanding, but in particular misunderstandings in relation to China itself. My view is sinology is increasingly critical. The reason I've set up the Centre for China Analysis in the Asia Society is that I want primary source-based objective analysis, which is integrated on China, to make sense for policymakers anywhere in the world and for corporate leaders anywhere in the world. Too much of policies at present, either coming out of Beijing or coming out of the DC think tank community, already carries with it an ideological assumption about who's right and who's wrong. Now, value judgments have to be made. Look at human rights, look at Xinjiang, look at the Uyghurs, okay? But I can give you value judgments about the American invasion of Iraq as well, which I opposed at the time when I was a member of the Australian Parliament. So therefore, it's important to deploy the skills of sinology, as I said at the beginning, to understand how China thinks, why it thinks that way, and why it's advancing the worldview that it does. Whether you agree with it or not, just get the analysis right. On the second question about Ukraine and the parallels between Vladimir the Impaler and Xi Jinping, the possibility of a conflict over Taiwan accidental, or could it be intended? My answer to that is both, and depending on the timeline we're talking about. My concern with this book, and why I wrote this book, is to avoid accidental war this decade, because neither side at present wants war, because neither side believes they have a surefire guarantee they would win. But I know what it's like when you get tripwired into something and you end up with escalation beyond your political control, one side or the other. That's what that book's about. As for war by intention, Xi Jinping, in a perfect world, would like to deploy his military and economic capabilities in the 2030s, when he thinks he'll be much stronger, in order to bring about the forceful reunification of Taiwan. I base it on a lot of analysis of what they're doing on both counts. Therefore, the answer for the 2030s is building effective deterrence now against that possibility. The United States, its allies, and the Taiwanese, both militarily, financially, economically, and in foreign policy terms, so that the Chinese political class in 2032, to plug a date out of the air, advise Xi Jinping, comrade chair, the risks are still too great. So that's the logic of it in the longer term. As for trade, and does it actually reduce or enhance the risk of conflict? I don't think it really does either. Those of you who are students of economic history and trade in particular will notice that economic globalization in the 20th century was at its height in 1914. It didn't help a lot when the crisis erupted with the guns of August. But I don't think it hinders, but it doesn't necessarily of itself help. Yeah, last few questions. We can do this group
All right.
in a lump. There's
Good.
4 of them.
Over there.
In June 2019, you delivered a speech at the Law Institute, and we asked you a question. For you, what does it mean to be Australian in one word? And you said the word you answered is respect. My question is, how would you describe Chinese identity in one word? And I'm not talking about the Chinese government's identity, but the Chinese civilian population. And how
You're talking about the Chinese civilian population, not the Communist Party.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And how could the Chinese civilian population help to minimize the potential war between the US and China? Thank you.
Thank you. Over there.
你好，谢谢您今天的演讲。I'm Wenjian. I'm from China, so my question is pretty straightforward and simple.
Sorry, I can't quite hear.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Pardon?
Can you hear me now?
I can.
Okay. 你好，谢谢您今天的演讲。And
可以吗？你可以说中文那好。
Do you want me to ask you in Chinese?
I don't care, whatever you prefer.
I'll do it in English.
I just couldn't quite hear the first bit.
Okay, so I'm gonna be like really straightforward and simple. So, in your opinion, do you think there's gonna be like a shift of the pandemic policy after this Congress?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the last two questions.
Thank you very much for your time. I'm Clemens. I'm from Germany, but I also spent a year in Australia for work and travel. And I wanted to.
Did you drink when you were down there?
Sorry? Drink? Of course, yeah.
Okay. He did go to Australia. Yeah.
One of the reasons I went. No. I wanted to return to the question about the Pacific Islands and ask what explicit policies Australia could take to convince the Pacific Islands to join the Western Alliance or align with the Quad rather than with China, who also offers development support.
Thank you.
Thank you. And the last one.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Jing Yi. I'm from Master of International Governance and Diplomacy. And I think nowadays discussions on China will usually lead to the discussions on its political system, that is the one-party system, or what we call the meritocracy. And the world outside of China has been portraying the Chinese system as authoritarian, as oppressive, while the Communist Party has been portraying the democracy as slow, inefficient, and probably unsuitable for China. So to add on to the list that you just mentioned, what China wants, I think China also wants desperately to prove that democracy is not necessarily the only political system that could deliver. So my questions will be, do you think these differences on ideology or differences in political system will impact China's relations with the world very in a strong
Okay, thank you for that. So let me give this one more blast before my brain fries completely. On the question of how would I define, I love the question from our Argentinian friend. Where are you? You're from Argentina?
You're from France.
Was that France? I'm sorry, I misunderstood. God, I must be getting deaf. How could you mistake Argentina for France? Zut alors. The Chinese civilizational identity, or Chinese people's identity in a single phrase, I would say prosperity. I don't say that in a pejorative sense at all if you've been through poverty as much as the Chinese people have in history and in recent times. And how does that help inform a Chinese view which would reduce great power tensions? Is that war kills prosperity, stone dead. Second question is, will the policy on the pandemic shift after the 20th Party Congress? Yes. It will do so through a series of trials of the Hong Kong model, starting in Guangdong and then moving to other provincial cities. And if that's successful, after the NPC in March, you'll see the gradual removal of it. And notifications that I'm aware of to the Chinese public health system would seem to suggest that on the ground as well. Number 3, Pacific Islands, to our German beer-drinking friend. Are you Bavarian?
No, I'm from Berlin.
I thought you had to be Bavarian to drink a lot. Not really, okay. I go back to my answer on the Pacific Islands before. It's important to be respectful of the islands in themselves and what they want. And for them, climate is existential. three of them, it's doubly existential. The Marshall Islands, Kiribati and Tuvalu. And I know all three governments quite well. And so therefore, I'll now make another partisan political comment. When the previous Australian Conservative government said, we don't intend to act radically or significantly at all on climate change because it will damage our hydrocarbon industries. That message was heard loud and clear across those countries. And as a consequence, that, together with the previous Conservative government's decision to cut development assistance to the Pacific Island countries to levels which weren't restored until 10 years, to the levels that I had when I left office till 10 years later, that sent a clear message. So what we did when we were in office was I saw it as my responsibility as Prime Minister of Australia, with close relations with 13 island states, was to be their advocate in the world. And I remember in the Copenhagen conference, where we had huge fights in those days with China and India, over 1.5 degrees. And I had sitting next to me the then and now again President of the Maldives, and Nasheed, who said to me, Kevin, just go in and fight for us because we need that outcome. If you look at the language in the Copenhagen Accord, it says to keep temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade. I'm the inventor of below 2 degrees centigrade to get us on the road to 1.5. And I had the Sheikh Hasina from Bangladesh sitting on my other side. So, and if you look at the 40 to 50 million people in Bangladesh who are exposed within a 1 foot sea level rise, I mean, it's just a disaster. So, being their advocate is the most important thing to do. And the last question, which is, the big question about democracy. Minzhu. Who studies Chinese here? Min, zhu. Min means people. Zhu means the lord of, or the person in control of. And so the people being in control, which is why when Sun Yat-sen led the Chinese Revolution of 1911, the Chinese anthem then and now today is called the Sanminzhuyi, and it's about the three people's principles, one of which is democracy. So the essential divide is this. We believe that democracy in not just the West, but the rest of the democratic world is premised on electoral democracy. That is, we vote for contesting and competing political candidates, which Arantxa's been through, which I've been through, which is a complete pain in the neck. But it's the price that you pay for being in the political process. And as a result, our political legitimacy proceeds from the ballot box. And that democracy is not just electoral democracy, it's a rolling democratic exercise through the institutions of elected assemblies, parliaments, etc. The Chinese authoritarian system, and I call it that deliberately, argues instead for performative democracy, and the new term used by the Chinese system is 全过程民主, whole of process democracy. I follow this literature reasonably closely. In other words, the Chinese system is seeking to redefine the term away from the electoral and institutional process that I've just referred to one which says we're a meritocracy, we'll consult with the people, performative democracy, and be judged on our merits, except you can't vote us out. Now, that's why I disagree with the Chinese definition. I understand the question of the evolution of democratic concepts. Here we are in Paris. This school, Sciences Po, was established in 1872, just after the Paris Commune, when this city rose up against the Third Republic? Second Republic. Second Republic. Sorry, bad on French history. And you had this call for a radical extension of the franchise beyond what was produced in the revolutions of 1830 and 1848 and the limited bourgeois franchise at the time. And so when you look at the history that we've been through, these countries of the so-called advanced West have been relatively recently sub-democratic. In fact, the female franchise really came very late in the piece. You really didn't have an extensive women's vote until the 1920s and beyond. New Zealand and South Australia were the first places in the world to give women the vote, by the way. So well done. I'm from neither. But my ultimate question, therefore, is why is Xi Jinping so worried about Taiwan? 2 reasons. 1, he wants to complete Mao's revolution and have this province back within Chinese sovereignty. 2, he really doesn't like the idea that there you've got a Confucian society, entirely Chinese, which has decided of its own volition in the 1990s to move from being a military dictatorship to being a fully participatory democracy with an open political system, an open economy. They produce the most advanced microchips in the world, an open society, and the only country in Asia with same-sex marriage, for God's sake. So it demonstrates in practice, which is why the CCP doesn't like it, that this stuff does work. And South Korea, also a Confucian society, and at various times with a curious political affiliation with the mainland China through imperial times, has also demonstrated that this works. And Japan, also a semi-Confucian society with Shinto, archipelagic tradition, etc., also, at least in its post-45 circumstances, has demonstrated that, albeit through the duress of war and the change that was produced after the end of the Pacific War. So Taiwan, I think, represents the answer to the question, and India represents another answer to the question, which is even democracy at scale can work. And the Indian economy is now growing at 8% and China's growing at 2 or 3. So the functional model, that is the performative model, that authoritarian systems will always perform better than the sloppiness of our electoral democratic systems, I think has an empirical problem now as well. Back to you.
Well, that was a treat. So thank you very much, Kevin, for making us a little bit wiser. We take your war is avoidable, at least in this decade. We're going to reflect on that, but not tonight. You can take the rest of the week off. Thank you very much.